potential market surprise. Because last year, as you remember, when people had to revise their expectation about Fed cuts in the second half of the year, you had a 10% correction. Now, this year, in spite of the Fed signaling we're not going to cut as soon as markets want, the market has gone up because, of course, there is the tech story. But suppose that the inflation remains sticky, closer to 3%, and then people say it's not going to be 3, it's going to be 2, it's going to be 1, maybe 0. I think that on net, in spite of stronger growth, the impact of high rates for longer is going to be negative. It's going to be a correction, it's not going to be a bear market, but there will be a correction, like last year. That will be my guess.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around an optimistic Nouriel Roubini, because this is about as optimistic as I've ever seen you. So are you basically saying that the worst case scenario, just to sort of cap it off, the worst case scenario is that the economy runs too hot, and that potentially, with hotter than expected inflation, it would cause the Fed policy to go a little bit longer than previously expected, which will cause a slight downdraft, but nothing to really write home about. Is that basically the worst case scenario from Nouriel Roubini right now?
For the markets, yes. For the markets, I would say soft landing would imply, of course, that the markets stay high, can go higher. What can lead to a correction today? More than a bumpy landing with a short and shallow recession, it's going to be a no landing. But that's for the US. If you look at the rest of the world, Europe and the UK is mediocre, China is mediocre, many emerging markets are fragile, Japan is rallying in the stock market, but the economy is just okay. So the rest of the world doesn't look great. I think it's a US story.
Elisa was listening to expand this list, Nouriel. She's got a list of things to worry about. She was hoping that you'd give us some help this morning.
This is not helpful. This is not helpful.
Not helping at all.
No, I don't have anything extra
to
add to
it. As I said, I wrote an entire book titled Mega Threats, where I say that over the next decade, there'll be lots of stuff that can go wrong.
It's true.
And there'll be serious stagflationary forces in the global economy. But those are medium-term kind of trends. In the short run, the US economy is doing well. The technology story is right. But as I said, whether it's going to be artificial intelligence essentially rescuing us as opposed to human stupidity having to do the wrong policies. There are plenty of wrong policies. I think it'll be the battle between the two, and there are lots of headwinds in terms of stagflationary shocks to the world over the next decade.
Let's talk about something that could go right down in D.C. US lawmakers reaching a deal to avoid an imminent shutdown and fund parts of the government through the end of September. House and Senate leaders will vote on the matter in coming days. The deal leaving parts of the government, including Defense and Homeland Security, facing a March 23 shutdown. That deal will be tougher to negotiate, given ongoing disputes, AMH, over the US-Mexico border.
Yeah, that's right. So they've avoided the first deadline for a government shutdown almost. We can all say with confidence they're likely not going to shut down. Falls short of some conservative demands, Jonathan, but there's nothing in here that's offensive to, say, a moderate or even some on the hard right or hard left for voting for this. The issue is going to be when they try to hammer out this defense deal and also funding Homeland Security, because they want the Senate also to take up their bill to impeach Alejandro Mayorkas. So this is what we're dealing with as we look to the end of the March. It's going to be a much tougher negotiation.
I think we're all super happy that we can move past some of this and talk about other things. Let's talk about this. China set to unveil its 2024 economic targets at the National People's Congress tomorrow. The party expected to announce a growth target of 5%. Officials hoping for an economic recovery as the nation grapples with deflation, an ongoing property crisis, mounting debt, and a flight to foreign capital. Economists at JP Morgan expecting policy to stay growth-friendly, but warning not to expect a, quote, bazooka-type stimulus. Enda Curran joins us now to talk more about this. Enda, can we just talk about tradition? The last 30 years, what would typically happen before this and what isn't happening now? How big a change is this?
It's a big change. So the set piece of the NPC every year, John, was a press conference by the Premier, a rare opportunity for the press to put some questions to one of China's top leaders, and of course for the rest of the world to hear from their own mouth what the outlook for China is. Well, this year that press conference has been cancelled, and the Chinese government have made clear that they're also not going to run this annual press conference during the remainder of this current government's term either. So you would have to say, from the outside looking in, that is a curious step. You could almost say a retrograde step for a government that's already under a lot of scrutiny when it comes to transparency from overseas investors. There's a domestic angle on it as well, by the way. You have some China watchers making the point that it's another example of the Premier losing some of his status and all the power going to the General Secretary, President Xi Jinping. So no press conference from the Premier this year. I think it does leave a bit of a hole in the annual in China's economic calendar.
Speaking of transparency, the past few months we saw China go through the shortest term for a foreign minister, the shortest term for a defense minister. Any update on some of these key political positions?
Well, we know that some of them have been more or less shuffled out of their positions by now. We'll get more detail on all of the personnel moves this week, Anne-Marie. Of course, on the Chinese side, the officials there say that it's not unusual for people to move in and out of government roles. That happens in other governments right around the world. But of course, as you say, in particular with China, we had the defence minister and the foreign minister both having high-profile roles on the global stage up until a point whereby they no longer were prominent and, in fact, were nowhere to be seen. And that, of course, speaks to this whole idea about the black box element when it comes to looking at China at the moment. A lot of investors and outsiders wondering about what direction the government is taking, a lot of focus on the transparency of the government these days, whether it's economic data or whether it comes to personnel movements in the government. And this week that's why this week is so important. We'll get the roadmap for the government, for the economy for the year ahead. And as you say, we'll get some detail on the personnel moves, which will be very closely scrutinised indeed by China watchers.
And just before we go, what kind of growth can we expect from China this year?
Look, as you say, they're going to expect it to come in around 5%. That's going to be hard given the base effect. Look out for this commentary around high-quality growth, John. That's the key for this year's MPC. Look for what they're talking about. Technology, innovation and industrial policy. Those are the key sectors to keep an eye on.
And thank you, sir. And Karen, down in Washington, D.C. on the latest with China. Just a final word now from Nouriel Roubini of Roubini Macro Associates. Nouriel, if growth in China drops to 2 to 3%, how will we know? Are they going to tell us?
Probably they're going to massage the data, as they always do. But I think there are other indicators of economic activity of China that cannot be manipulated.
What would you look to?
I would look at their PMIs. They're usually a good indicator of what's happening. So sometimes they say 5% growth, but the PMIs right now falling even below 50%. That implies the economy is slowing down, if not starting to contract. So there are ways to gauge what the economy is doing. They cannot lie about everything. Of course, sometimes when some numbers like youth unemployment are bad, you just
stop reporting it.
Don't report it. Or like when economy is bad, you don't have the premier having the press conference. But it's actually self-defeating because right now China is becoming more and more uninvestable. It's in part because we don't have data, there's no transparency, there's more opaqueness, and then people are living further, both the domestic and foreign investors. So they shoot themselves in the foot thinking that opaqueness is going to help them. It doesn't help them.
Do we have some data in the form of oil prices, iron ore, copper, that have all been much lower than people expected?
They have, but some of them are driven by demand factors. Other of them are driven by supply. For example, in the case of energy prices overall, there's been a significant increase in productive capacity, even of fossil fuels, even in the United States, or LNG and things of that sort. So I would say that historically, movements of energy price or commodity were driven more by demand and reflecting what's happening to global growth or Chinese. But right now, there's also a meaningful shift in supply. Even with the green metals, people said demand is going to grow because of the green revolution. Supply is going to be constrained by regulation. But there's tons of nickel, lithium, cobalt around the world, and some of these mines are coming. And that's why sometimes you see 50% drops in the price of green metals. It's supply-driven as opposed to demand-driven.
A lot of this has been way too constructive. Before you go, just not to disappoint Bramo, this book, Mega Threats, that came out a number of years ago now, time flies. Can you tell us the number one mega threat that you think hasn't been talked about enough since you published that book?
I would say that people are still underestimating the impact over time of global rivalries on the global economy. So far, the impact has been modest, but I see a world in which the conflicts between a number of revisionist powers, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and US, Europe, the West, is going to become a colder war. We already have actually two hot wars, one Russia-Ukraine, the other one, of course, Israel and Hamas, but it's just a proxy for Israel and Iran. And the Cold War between US and China this year may not escalate, but over the medium term, I think that the Cold War is going to get colder. There's a risk within this decade that eventually the conflict on Taiwan is going to come to something of a boil because, Xi Jinping wants to pass to history as the man that reunited mainland with Taiwan. So something's going to happen. And so far, I think markets have been calm because these risks have not been materializing or their economic impact has been modest. But I would say over the next few years, geopolitical things are going to get worse.
Nouriel, it's good to see you. Great to catch up.
Great seeing you.
Thank you, sir. The brilliant, the wonderful Nouria Rabini of Rabini Macro Associates. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning. We can do that with your Bloomberg Brief. Here is Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Boeing confirmed it is in talks to buy former division Spirit AeroSystems. The part supplier is at the center of the issues affecting the 737 MAX jet. Boeing saying in a statement, quote, "We believe the integration of Boeing and Spirit AeroSystems manufacturing operations would further strengthen aviation safety, improve quality, and serve the interests of our customers, employees, and shareholders." Shares in Macy's higher pre-market. Investors boosted a takeover bid for the retailer. Archouse Management and Brigade Capital Management increased their offer by 14%. It's now $24 a share. It was $21. That's a 33% premium to the close on Friday. Macy's rejected the bid earlier in January, instead unveiling a restructuring plan where it will close a third of its namesake locations and grow its Bloomingdale's and Bluemercury brands. California and parts of the U.S. West Coast are set to face more dangerous wind gusts and deep snow to start the week, after already days of winter weather blanketed the area with up to as much as 8 feet of snow. The deadly conditions forced road closures between California and Nevada. Amtrak canceled trains across the region. That's your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Hey, Danny, thank you. Up next on this program, making the case for no rate cuts.
A very reasonable case for zero cuts. Have a Fed pivoting, doing a dovish pivot into 3.7% unemployment with GDP continuing to be strong is really pretty remarkable.
Torsten Slok, Apollo, says no rate cuts in 2024. That conversation up next.
The world needs ways to reduce carbon emissions.
ExxonMobil can